Hello, everybody, and welcome back from the holiday if you are in the States. I know our guest today is not in the States, so we were having a nice chuckle about Black Friday and Cyber Monday. So we are glad that everybody has found some time to join us. Before we get into the details of everything, let's run through our sort of house rules, which are very simple. We're here to discuss the buyer-aligned sales strategy and how to increase your win rate. So it should be a very fun and informative conversation. I've taken a look at the content. It's going to be very great. We are recording the session, so if you need to step out, feel free to come back and take a listen or share it once it is sent out publicly. Also, we do love to make our webinars very interactive, so please ask questions as we go along. We don't like to hold them till the end. We want to ask questions in live time and relevance. I'll be monitoring that. Please go into the chat section and introduce yourself. We always like to create a sense of community around our webinars. Welcome to give your name, the name of your company. Even plug yourself in the chat session. Let people know what you do or how big your team is or something fun about you. And with all that out of the way, I'd like to take a moment and introduce our sponsor and our speaker today, which is George Bronton. And George, did I pronounce your last name right?
Perfect. Sounds great.
Okay, great. George is the founder and CEO of MEMBRAIN. He's a lifelong entrepreneur, been doing this for, a little bit like me, a little over 20 years. Maybe I've been around a little bit longer. But he's got a passion for sales and marketing, and he's got this great motto that I love called "Don't settle for the mainstream," which I think is so appropriate for everything we have to do in sales, is we always have to be learning and educating ourselves and listening. George is also always looking for ways to improve the business process, which is really sort of how MEMBRAIN came about, as I understand it. He's been working on this project, MEMBRAIN, since 2012, and they've done a ton of research with sales leaders. They've identified the success factors behind successful sales organizations, not just the rep, but the whole organization. And the result is this SaaS platform called MEMBRAIN. We're not really here to talk about that today, but by all means, we certainly want to support our sponsors. George also shares his thoughts about sales and science and sales and marketing, called the art and science of the complex sale. So if you are feeling like you're in a complex sales environment, and we'll get into the definition of that for sure, definitely sign up for George's blog. It's award-winning. It's one of my new favorite blogs that I discovered this year. So I'm very excited when I see that stuff come from George. So with all that, George, welcome. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having me, and thanks for the warm introduction.
Yeah, our pleasure, our pleasure. I'm going to sort of step back and sort of turn it over to you. I know you're controlling the screens. I'll probably jump in with questions from either myself or from the audience from time to time, but let's go ahead and get started.
Yeah, absolutely. So first off, I have this slide showing kind of the problem we're facing today in selling, and that's that we are not being very effective. So I pulled this off the CSO Insights, and they've been doing this study year after year and asking people how well their salespeople are reaching quota. And I find this one pretty alarming because it's dropped for the last 5 years with 10%. So one could think that with all the technology we have at our disposal and all the information available online, we should all be getting better and more effective, right? So I think this is pretty alarming, and I call this the sales effectiveness crisis. And Richard, go ahead.
Yeah, no, so my thought was that, I see this all the time too, and I take it with a little bit of a grain of salt because I feel like this slide, when you see a repetition like this year after year, it also tells me that people aren't setting their numbers aligned right. So to some extent, I think it is true that the sales reps aren't hitting quota, but it also means that people are not putting together realistic numbers when you see 5 years of declining. So I put a little bit of this pressure back on management and the board and this sort of constant need for acceleration in the startup world.
Yeah, so, I think that's absolutely right.
But God forbid we actually say that to our bosses because they would never admit that they were wrong. It's always our fault, right?
Well, it's kind of funny though, Richard, because they also ask in the same survey, like how many of these companies are, despite their salespeople not reaching quota, how many increase the quota year on year? And that number is at 92.5%.
So basically they're jacking the quota to make sure they get paid their bonus, but they don't care if the sales rep gets paid, right?
Yeah, I don't know why this is happening, but I think there's a big mismatch. And another number that's not showing here, but that's also interesting, is that the overall quota attainment or the overall performance achievement for the company is actually above 85, I think 87 or something %.
Right, because that's where their bonuses lie. Right. That's
but that
fine.
tells me that we have a lot of top performers that pull a lot of weight because we're achieving near to the complete performance target, but so many are missing quota. So the bulk of the salespeople are not doing that well, but we have those that are doing extremely well.
This is true. And I think that's true in most organizations, right? So well, let's go forward from there.
Yeah, so another thing that sort of, this was one of the reasons why I started MEMBRAIN, because I did a big shift from selling transactional software products to selling more, let's call it more intrusive, more high-ticket items, more complex products. And I see this happening all over, right? Thanks to the internet, we can automate a lot. If the product is transactional, we don't need salespeople for that, right? If we have good marketing, we can create a pool in the market. We can automate a lot of that transactional sales. But on the other hand, I think the complex selling environments are getting more complicated, more complex because of the global competition. So,
what's funny? So you know, it's interesting. You were saying that the transactional stuff you don't necessarily need the salesperson. So I agree with you to some types of transactional sale, right? Like for example, Amazon has clearly made that occur, right? But there's still part of that also comes down to product market fit, right? If the market's not ready, then you're going to have an outbound team, even if it's a simple product, right?
Absolutely.
Even if it's a simple solution. So there's definitely a little bit of feedback around that, because I don't think you can really get rid of. I don't think we can oversimplify transactional sales and say we don't need salespeople. I think it depends on how that product market fit. But I do see that. I see us moving in that direction, right? Like, there are lots of organizations who would eventually love it to be, a do-it-yourself model, right? It's low cost of sale. It's all kinds of things that come with that. But even in that transactional statement, I think you've got to sort of look at that a bit. You used the word a minute ago that I really like, at least here in the States, and for those of you who don't know, George is over in Europe, in Stockholm. So, we hear the word disruption a lot. We need to be a disruptor. We've got to disrupt. And I love that you use this word intrusion, right? Like it's always nice to hear that. My question for you is, do you see a difference between those two things, between a disruption and an intrusion?
Yes.
Or do you feel they are the same thing?
No, I think there's a difference, because disruptive in my world comes from the tech scene and the software space and the technology space. And you are introducing something that's 10x better than something else, or completely different than what people were used to before. Like Uber is probably a good example, that you're doing something in a new way. So, and I think there's a lot of hype around that. But that doesn't mean, so that would be intrusive to the competition maybe, but it's not intrusive for the customer. Quite the opposite. I mean, it's really simple for me to open the Uber app and request an Uber.
Right.
But when I'm talking about intrusive, I'm talking about it from the buyer's perspective. Maybe if you look at an operation, if you need to go into surgery and do a heart transplant, I mean, that's extremely intrusive on your body, right? But if you do something else, you just take a flu shot, that's not very intrusive. So maybe that's a way to look at it, that it will disrupt, and I'm using that word, it will disrupt the buyer's day-to-day work. So if I'm introducing a new ERP system, that could potentially cause the whole business to stop if we don't do it right. That could be very disruptive and intrusive.
Yes.
And so now you see I'm interchanging the words even, so maybe I'm not following.
No, I'm glad that, it's important to have these distinctions, right? And even if we don't always know the answers, the question, it's good for us to sort of just position the question for not just ourselves, but hopefully for the audience. So let's continue on then. Let's go forward.
Yeah. So I think talking about that complexity, which we already started, is really the more complex that purchase becomes for the buyer. I think this is where we we need to think about it maybe a bit differently than we have. It's not just about the money, right? So one could think that, okay, the complexity of a deal increases with the dollar amount. That might be true, but it might also not be true, right? If you're a large organization and you're buying, I don't know, 2,000 new chairs, that's not very complex. It's a pretty transactional deal, even though it can have a high order value.
Right.
But back to that ERP system implementation, that could be really, really expensive. Although the per seat price is a lot less than a chair, it could be very intrusive, and it could cause a lot of problems within the company. So the perceived risk is higher for the buyer.
So when you talk about, again, when you talk about the complex sale, right, like we often think in the sales world, the complex sale means, multiple buyers, the size of the deal, et cetera. You're taking it and saying, well, the complex sale also depends on the complexity for the buyer to implement. Is that also what you're trying to define it?
Yes, definitely. The perceived risk for the buyer and, of course, the investment of time and people and resources in general. So that's why I have this slide on the screen. I hope that's showing. It's like you have those on an axis. So you can invest a lot of money and time, or a lot of money, but the risk is low, so it becomes less complex. But if you have a high perceived risk and a high investment of time and people, then it becomes very complex. And then you need a lot of high touches to get that perceived risk down, so that they trust that you will do a good job implementing this system that you're selling them. And then you reduce the perceived risk and also the complexity of the deal. So yeah, yeah, absolutely. It's also about the number of stakeholders, and that's going up. We've seen that in all these studies as well. More people are getting involved, and I think technology is a bit to blame.
Why do you say that? What makes you think it's a technology thing?
I think everything now is so interconnected, right? We all collaborate and we use technology. So if we're going to implement, so I think a lot of the listeners on your show here is SaaS and tech companies, right? So we want to sell software products to companies, and that means that even if we would like to sell it to one stakeholder, it's not going to happen in most of the cases, because we'll have more stakeholders that want to be involved, because the technology will touch them as well.
Yeah, I often encourage people as they're trying to figure out their deal as to, it's not always about who's involved in making the decision, right? Like, we do need to figure that as we close a deal, but who else would be affected by this purchase?
Exactly.
Right? Because those are the people who are also going to be oftentimes sort of the silent, that silent no sometimes, right?
Yeah.
Depending on the, even with your tool, even with MEMBRAIN, I'm sure that your tool touches other departments besides sales in some way, and so by just touching them, it means they have a certain level of influence over that decision-making process.
They will want to have a say as well. We see a lot of other, legal might want to be involved, because they're going to be touching the opportunities that sales is bringing forward, et cetera, et cetera. So yeah, that's something that we can sometimes forget, that there are hidden stakeholders, and if we don't bring them in early, they're going to come in late and ruin the deal. What a great statement. That is so true. If we don't discover the hidden stakeholders early, they're going to come in late and ruin the deal. So appropriate. So it really is about who's affected by this purchase, not just who has influence or buying authority over it. So sort of reiterating that for the audience, I think that was a really valuable statement. And I also think I'm going to move on to the next slide, but I think we need to realize that the sales process it's not just one process, right? So we should break that down into multiple processes. And in prospecting, when we go out, we do inbound and outbound prospecting. That's a very different workflow than when we're managing a complex opportunity or when we're planning an account. So I think the skill sets and how you organize your teams, of course, need to be different. And so parts of the sales process, even though your end goal is to win a big complex deal, it may start off as a very transactional workflow, right, in the prospecting efforts. You're just trying to get that first meeting. So you're going to be pretty transactional in the beginning of the process. And it's all about volume and researching and being relevant to the buyer to get to that first meeting. So everything you do there might be more similar to a transactional environment than what you then do in a later stage when you're driving that complex opportunity.
Yeah. So we actually have a question from the audience. So I'll turn this one before we go on to the next slide, which is, how do you navigate through a situation where the customer doesn't want to continue on with their status quo, but has their own internal battles and sees purchasing the solution as a very risky in terms of change management? That's a great question from Joanna, right? Like, it is as much about change management as it is about, improving efficiencies and reducing wasted time, right? And you've got your champion who wants to make the change, but they've got their own internal battles. How do you navigate through a complex sale like that?
Yeah, I mean, that's a great question, and I would say that all complex sales is really change management. That's what it is, right? You want to help someone move from one situation to another situation, and if they don't see a big enough gap between where they are now and where they could be tomorrow using your tool, they're not going to move, right? So it's all about visualizing that, and I think you need, in that kind of situation, you can take different approaches to it. You could work each stakeholder individually, sort of do the buyer persona approach and try to get them to buy into their motivational drivers, or you get everyone in a room and try to see everyone see the same vision.
Yep, I think that's part of it too, and I think, Joanna, part of your question is that it's very possible that you aren't working with a champion, you're working with a cheerleader, right? That happens a lot, where we think we found someone who's really wants to use us, but they don't necessarily have the juice to pull it off. In some sales, it can often be, from what I've seen, it could be the end user of your product, even though they see the value in it, and they see what it's going to bring for the company, but for whatever reason they can't get that value further upstream for other people to understand it and see it. So it could be that you have a cheerleader, not a champion, is also part of the problem, which would go back to what George is saying in terms of you either need to get everybody in the room all at once, or you need to sort of try and pick them off one by one and making sure you understand your value proposition as it's related to those other titles. So Joanna, I hope that helped you sort of gain some clarity on there. Let's talk a second, because we kind of hinted at it and started talking about this whole ICP, right? And that again, I think ICP is another word that means a lot, and it's been great, but maybe it's overplayed these days. I'm not so sure. I'm not so sure it's about the ideal customer profile as much as it is sort of what's the pain of those people. But as you talk about the complex sale, right? As you talk about defining complexity for your customers, how do you do that as you're also trying to figure out who those buyers are within that? Are you trying to run those two analyses, parallel to each other? Do they go hand in hand? Where do you start, I think, is the right place?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think the starting point must be the problem that you're trying to solve, and how that relates back to your buyer. And I think maybe this is also related to the question that was asked, and that's, I think we're jumping ahead. I mean, most of the time we're trying to pitch product before we really help the buyer understand what we can help them solve and how that ties to what they're really trying to accomplish, what's high up on their agenda. So yeah, ideal customer fit, I think it's not a bad thing, but as soon as we have these acronyms, we tend to read about them, and then we put them in sort of a box in our head. This is what they mean.
Yes.
And
ICP, TAM.
Yeah.
Sorry.
Yeah, exactly.
What's my total addressable market? Yes.
And these are all great, but I think what I see a lot of companies doing wrong, especially with the whole marketing automation thing that's been going on, is that they put a lot of crap into their pipeline.
Yes.
And I think this is where we need to be careful. We need to really make sure that we qualify the deals before we put them into the pipeline. And some of those criteria can be sort of hard facts, which I think about when I hear ICP. It's like, okay, industry, size of client, et cetera, et cetera. But a lot of those could also be more soft things like buyer type or decision-making type. Or
what does that mean to you when you say, can you define that for the audience?
Yeah, so it means that I think a lot companies make decisions differently. So some are very analytical. So they're going to send you an RFP and they're going to have like an Excel spreadsheet that they weigh, and others are more gut feel, have a gut feel approach to it, and they want to talk to different vendors and see who feels right, and they sort of assume that the products are similar. So I think you need to figure out what type of organization they are by engaging with them. That's more of a soft qualifier.
So can you give maybe you said it, but let's really try and define 3 types. And again, let's not put this in that bucket in our head you just mentioned, but like, what are 3 types that people can kind of walk away going, oh, I need to start listening for that or looking for that? Is it that, that they like to do the, decision by committee type thing? Is it that they're the kind of company that's always asking about ROI? Like, are those the kinds of things that are maybe a little bit more soft?
No, yeah, I think you're onto it. I see in some methodologies they use scorecards for this, right? So you can ask a question like, okay, how have you made a purchase like this in the past? How did you go about making that decision? Mm-hmm. They tell you, well, I spoke to the CEO and he told me to research it. I presented it and he went with my advice. Or we called in a big committee and we sat in a room and we gathered all this big matrix of how we're going to make a decision. So you can listen to those replies. Especially you need to have, of course, a good trust, a good sponsor to get that kind of meaty information.
Have you guys done any research on that? Just out of curiosity, has MEMBRAIN done research to see, like, just within your own organization, the people who buy you, we know that 20% are, decision by committee. We know another 20% are champion plus 1 C-level executive. Like, you guys, that would be amazing research.
Yeah,
I think people would find it fascinating, right?
Yeah, we haven't really done. I wouldn't call it research, but so I'm sure a lot of people on the call have read Crossing the Chasm with Jeffrey Moore.
Yep.
And he explains sort of you get the early adopters and then you have to cross the chasm to get to the laggards and all that stuff. And I think what we're seeing is really we are attracting the early adopters, those who understand that enabling your salespeople, ensuring that there is structure to your sales efforts. Those who get that, we sell to now, and they can be making the decision in a committee or they can make it from gut feels. But it's more about early adopters for us, so the life cycle of the client. So not so much maybe, we haven't really done that, but we have a research company in Sweden called ProSales, which I could recommend you guys looking into. They've done some research on this very topic, and they call it something like buying culture or something, which is quite an interesting read.
That's great. That's great. Well, let's move forward a little bit, because I know that we're sort of getting into process versus methodology as you sort of start to think about this. So why don't you share your vision on that?
Yeah, so I talk a lot about process in my blog and of course of methodology as well. But when I speak about this, I can hear that they sometimes get mixed up. So what's the process? What's the methodology? So I just find it helpful to explain what the difference is. And for me, the process is really the structure, so the stages and the information and the milestones, so that we execute consistently. And the methodology are more the tactics, the how to do things, which you see, like, it's been a lot of talk about the different methodologies. I shouldn't probably mention Challenger Sales because they don't want to be a sales methodology, but any of those really it comes down to how should you be communicating, or how should you be working with your client to effectively move them through that process. So I think process without methodology doesn't really work, and you can't have a methodology without a process. Doesn't really work either. So to be effective, you really need to merge these two.
I agree. I think they actually are interchangeable in many ways, that what some people call a process is as much a methodology as the methodology is part of the process. So I don't know if it should just be called methoprocessy or something like that.
Yeah, but it's interesting though, because we work with sales training companies, and
Right.
and they're very strong on the methodology part. And some of them are
Yep.
struggling when I ask them to place their methodology inside of a process.
Yep. They struggle with it.
They do. They struggle with it because they see the process as being very, I mean, customer specific, which it could be. But just placing your methodology on top of a process, I think that's when it becomes really powerful, right?
Yes.
But
I do that a lot too.
Yeah. And then you have to coach on that.
Yeah, no, we're getting to two of my favorite slides, right? If everybody's attended my webinars, it's always fun to talk about best practices, but we don't achieve those best practices without falling on our face a little bit. So let's talk about some mistakes that you've seen, right? And sharing your wisdom around those.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I think, I mean, the topic of today is really about aligning with a buyer, and I think a lot of times we just too quickly jump into presentation mode. We want to show the customer our stuff, right?
Yep. Pitch the demo.
Yeah, pitch the demo, go for the demo, and we don't really know exactly how that our product ties into their ambitions and what they want to achieve, so it just falls flat, right? So we don't relay that business value because we're jumping into presentation mode, I think.
Yep.
So those are, I think, the main ones. But then maybe the biggest one that causes most deals to die is not understanding how the decision will be made, like we already touched on, right? Like who will have to be involved for this decision to be made, and it's not always the people you think it is, right?
Right.
So you don't understand that decision team, and you're just engaging with a sponsor who's like an empty suit. He or she can't make a decision, can't even rally up the team inside of that company to be enthusiastic about the solution. I think that's a huge issue. And then, of course, the strength of the status quo. The question earlier was really a proof point of this, I think. It's so, I mean, as human beings, we hate change most of the time, right? It's comfortable to be in the status quo. So even if you're talking to a company and they have this awful solution in place, people have gotten used to the workarounds.
Yes.
They're just like, oh, I know it's not perfect, but this is how it is.
Right.
And, I don't want to change.
The perceived pain of change is greater than the pain they experience.
Exactly. So yeah.
Or at least in their head, right? What I want to come back to this relaying business value piece, right? Because I think you're right that understanding the status quo is kind of like the hidden piece that people don't ask about. Like, it's a fairly simple question to ask, is to say, how willing is your company towards change, right? What is happening? I think in sales we see a lot of it, at least from my perspective on the sales training world, is like, and maybe even with you with MEMBRAIN, because that's who you're selling to that team, is when they have legacy sales reps who've been doing it this way for 5 years or 10 years, change is hard for those people, right?
Yeah.
And that's understandable. I'm not saying that they're wrong. That's just the way the world is. But I want to come back to this failing to relay business value, because I feel like that's where we often get stuck in sales, right? We have the first meeting goes great, and then people go dark. And there's a lot of reasons why. Maybe they pitched the demo, right? They went into presentation mode too much. They didn't do great discovery. How do you coach people to improve talking about the business value, right? Relaying that business value. It's often the why, right? Why someone wants to use MEMBRAIN is often more important than what they want MEMBRAIN for, right? Is it as simple as that, or do you see it differently?
I think what we can do, I mean, traditionally we've been taught to do a good discovery call and ask a lot of questions, and I think that's still critical. But today we can do a lot more research. So just if we're selling into a decent sized company, we can do a lot of research about what's important to this client for this fiscal year. It's right in their reports, right? The financial reports that they put out. So you can read those, and it will be in those papers, in that documentation, you can see what's important to them on a high level, right? So if we can connect to those, then we can have already in the initial exploration call, we can sort of try to align with their important initiatives, which could rub off on us. So that our project that we're trying to pitch to them is going to be a part of that overall initiative, which is strategic to them.
Yep.
That's one way to really, can we research and find out what's important to them and align with that? I think that's very, very powerful. And if we can't research that, that's what our questions should be all about, right?
What kind of questions would those be for you, like in your world as you're thinking about that?
Well, so I think first we need to understand where is this company? Is it a high growth company? Is it all about growing? And then we need to help them achieve that. Is it a turnaround situation where they're declining in revenues and they need to do something differently because of that? So just finding out where this company is on their trajectory. Of course, the people, do they have a new CEO or a new sales director who just came in and want to make a big impact? And so it's all about timing and people and just finding those things out. And instead of just like assuming that you know what they want because that's what you sell. But I also think that you mentioned that some are reluctant to change, and that's a problem, and it can be. But it can also be in the SaaS world we're living in. It could also be a problem if they're too much early adopters and shiny objects people, right? Because they, well, I see those as well. They jump on everything that sounds cool. It's like, oh, I want to buy it, and then they jump right in, and then next week there's something else that's cool. So they don't really implement the service you're selling them, and then they churn. So we also have to be careful with those people and say, okay, hang on. I mean, we're trying to change how your sales team works. You're going to become more effective. So you need to tie some long-term goals to this project, or else we've seen other clients fail. So sometimes you need to reel those ones in as well that are too enthusiastic for change.
No, I agree. Great. Well, we spent a little bit of extra time on this slide. Let's go ahead and move forward.
Managers, right? That's a big one as well, right? I think the main thing that I see happening is that you promote your best salesperson to a sales manager, because that's how it should be, right? But without giving that person the right skill set, the right tools, the right time to do their work, and maybe even without understanding if that person is even interested in being a sales manager and what it takes to become a good sales manager.
So that, I see that a lot too.
Yeah, and I think that what you see as a result of that is that because they know how to sell, and maybe that's what motivates them, is to go get that sale, take the win, and high five with your team, hand it over to delivery of the customer success team. So they get their adrenaline rush from closing a deal, so they jump in and rescue deals instead of coaching their sales people to become better sales people. So they sell through for the team instead of through them. I think that's really the big one that I see. And I agree. Mindset thing.
Yeah, I think it's a bit of a mindset. The other thing too is that I see reps, and maybe this is what you mean by trying to manage by results, is they spend too much time behind the computer, right? Like they're stuck behind their running reports. And sometimes that's because they're too nervous or afraid to actually do it to get out there and manage, or they don't know how to get out there and manage. Oftentimes it's management just asking for data that's just really not relevant to the day-to-day of things. So, so I'm just curious if that's what you're seeing too.
Yes, absolutely. And I think there's also kind of an overload of information today. So you don't always know what should you be looking at. And I think a piece of work that I really think is fantastic is the book Cracking the Sales Management Code.
Yeah, that's a great book.
I mean, they really break those KPIs down and say, okay, these are results, that's your quota, then you have the objectives, and then you have the activities. And the only thing we can really manage are the activities that lead to the objectives, that lead to the results. And I think when you have a model like that, then you can start managing the right things, the activities, value driving instead of just looking at like the rear view mirror. It's like, oh, you didn't do well last quarter. It's like, no.
Right.
But why?
Totally agree.
Yeah.
Right.
So, yeah.
All right, let's go on. Let's go on to the next slide.
Yeah. Pilots. I think
these guys have a lot to do with sales, right?
Yeah, these guys, they're selling, you know, the right guy selling to the left guy. No, but seriously,
Right.
I think I read this book that I found really fascinating that had nothing at all to do with sales, and it's called the Checklist Manifesto. I don't know if you've read it. But
I have not read that one.
Yeah, no, it's not sales related. So I stumbled upon it. I think it was Bob Apollo who also writes a great blog who recommended it, and it was really interesting and fascinating because it was about this surgeon who figured out that a lot of times people die post-surgery because of simple mistakes, like they weren't washing their hands before surgery or the timing of the anesthesia was off. So he went out and looked at other professions and said, okay, what do other professions do to prevent these simple mistakes from happening that could cause lives to get lost? And they looked at pilots and they said, pilots use a checklist. That's pretty smart. Like they don't fly the plane without first checking off all these things. And so he went back to the surgeons and said, hey, I got an idea. Let's introduce a checklist. And they were like, are you kidding? I've been a surgeon for 25 years. I don't need no checklist. And they were very negative about that whole concept. But they did try it, and like all over the globe. And the result was that they reduced the number of deaths with 47%.
That's amazing.
I just found that when I read that number, it's like, Jesus Christ, that's amazing. And that's surgeons, right? They're very skilled. They've been trained a lot, and they do a surgery. The patient is one patient lying on a table still, right? And we're working with sales processes with like 6 months with 7 people involved, and yet we think that salespeople should know what to do. We don't need no checklist, right? So I just found the whole concept of checklists very fascinating because of the problems we talked about. Some of those problems are pretty simple, right? If we know that we have 5, 6, 7 people involved in a deal, why do we just talk to one person?
Yeah. So what are some of the examples that you see in a good checklist, right? Whether from the and you could probably have one at the rep level and the management level, right? What are the things you're looking for as you're talking about the checklist?
Yeah, that's a good question. So I have this slide first for effect, Richard.
Exactly. How appropriate that question came up.
Yeah, how appropriate. So I think I sometimes make this analogy, just how stupid it would be if the pilot's checklist was like, okay, board the plane, take off, fly, land, and then exit the plane. And everyone laughs like, oh, that's just silly. That you wouldn't need a checklist for that, right? But still, if we look at selling, the average sales checklist is basically a drop-down list in your CRM, which is like prospect, qualify, percent, quote, and then you either win or lose the deal.
Right.
And that's basically it. In a lot of sales teams that I encounter, that's the checklist they have. And then it's up to each salesperson to do their best within each stage to get to the next and win that deal. So I think it's just we lack a lot of content and context and guidance in the traditional tools that we have been using for so long, the CRMs. And this was really one of the reasons why I started MEMBRAIN, because I was failing in hiring and making salespeople perform in my previous company called Upstream. And the reason I was failing was that I was assuming that salespeople knew how to sell. And I thought, well, if they've been salespeople before, they have a nice CV, they've sold for someone else before successfully, they should be able to sell what I'm selling, right? But they didn't, right? So a stupid assumption. So I think that was my sort of takeaway was we cannot assume that salespeople know what to do, even if they've sold something before, because the world has changed and we need to do things differently now. So getting back to your question, what do good teams do? I think that comes back to the sales process, right? And the type of buyer and the buying process that we're trying to support. But we need to be much more granular than this. That's for sure.
Yeah, no, that's great. I think that's great. Let's go ahead. Actually, we have a question, another question coming from the audience, which is, what's the source of the declining rep sales quota achievement? At the beginning. That's Steve. We're going to hold that one till the end because now we're a little bit later. We talked about that at the beginning, so I'm going to hold that question. But let's go on with sales coaching. Sorry, George.
Yeah, no, it's fine. So I think coaching is one of those things that I see is happening far too poorly. So we touched on this already, that sales managers are stuck behind their desks and then running reports for management that are totally useless, creating forecasts that are off, instead of really coaching their team.
Yep.
So I think, and I've used the importance of frontline sales managers as the wording, but I think there's a huge leverage in increasing the skill set of the sales managers. Because if you have a good sales manager and they really know how to coach, they will do magic.
Yeah, I completely agree. How do you build that, right? How do you make that happen? Everybody talks about it, but I think it's the piece that everybody's missing.
Yes. Well, it's so difficult because I think it comes down to that willingness to be a coach, to have that mindset of wanting to see other people succeed. And if you've been a good performing salesperson, you might not have that mindset. Your mindset is probably to win deals, to be the hero. And now you have to make other people the heroes. And that's not always the same driver. If that's not what motivates you to help others succeed, I don't think you will coach, because it's not what makes you happy, right? So yeah, that's a big one for me.
I think part of it though is that nobody knows how to coach people to be coaches, right? Like, so,
definitely.
You know, I'm a Gen Xer. I say this all the time. Like, I didn't get, and I loved management. Like, I always wanted to be a manager because I always got, you know, as you said, I got excited by seeing other people do well, not just by closing the deal myself. But there was none of my managers above me taught me how to be a manager. Many of them didn't even teach me how to be a salesperson, to be honest with you. You kind of had to figure it out. And that's different. So I think that there's this generation of upper management that doesn't know how to coach coaches because they were never coached, right? They were never mentored. You know, we hear people talk about mentors. Oh, I have this mentor, I have that mentor. You know, look, when I was 25 to 35 and in business and in sales, the concept of a mentor was never discussed with me. Nobody ever suggested I should go get a mentor, and I certainly don't think that it means I didn't need one. I wish I had one. But it just, maybe the access to that kind of knowledge didn't exist because it was pre-internet. I hate to age myself. But I think there's this value of like upper management who don't know how to manage managers. Right? They don't know how to teach managers to manage. They don't know how to teach managers to look at that report and interpret the data other than, did you make enough dials today? Yeah. Right? You know, so that's one of the things I'm seeing is there's a lack of upper management teaching the new management team to come in and how to be an effective manager. I don't know if that's what you see too, or you know, maybe I'm just putting my own personal experience on it.
No, I definitely agree with you. But then I think there's a difference between a coach and a mentor as well. I think in a business environment, a manager is probably can be a good coach, but may rarely be a mentor. Because I think mentoring is a bit having a bit bigger perspective on things, like how do I make the most of my life? I need a mentor for that. Where I think business coaching is more, okay, how do I perform the best I can in this role that I have? So I think there's a scope difference in coaching and mentoring, but I definitely agree. And I guess it's inherited. Like, you would never, I mean, it's a mistake to promote your best performing salesperson into the sales manager in the first place. And if you were a good coach and really knowing what would be required to be a good coach, you wouldn't do that, right? So I definitely agree with you on that. I just want to highlight, I think it's so important because you can have the best technology in the world and the best processes in the world, but if you don't have those frontline sales managers that can coach your salespeople, help them grow as professionals, it's not gonna happen.
I completely agree.
And I think another thing that you touched upon is the inability to interpret data. And that may also be an age thing. I don't know, but
Yeah.
but I see customers, so we have a lot of analytics in our platform, and I can see sales managers or even leaders look at a dashboard with trending graphs and not understand it, not understand how to interpret it and how to coach people based on the insights that's available right there on their screen. And to me, that's fascinating. I don't really know why that is, or if it's just something in the back of their head that says they really don't want to coach. But
I don't know the answer to that either, but I see it all the time. So, and it's certainly something I struggled with as a manager when I was going through the ranks, which was, I was the head of sales operations for an API management company, and it's like there's a ton of data. How to interpret the sales data around that was not always the easiest thing for me. And fortunately enough, I had a boss who, when I would say to him, look, I understand how to get you this data. I can run all the reports till the cows come home and create the dashboard. But where I'm lacking is understanding how to interpret that. Can you help me? And I had to, it's also a scary thing as a manager to go ask your boss to say, I don't know how to interpret that. But fortunately, my boss was cool enough to say, well, sure, let's spend some time on that. And so I thought that was, I see that all the time today. And believe me, that was in 2011. This isn't a long time ago. So.
Yeah, and there's so much data out there, but you really need to know how to interpret it, because then based on that information, like if we see that we are selling very well into one specific industry vertical, then we should adjust our strategy and our segmentation efforts accordingly, right? But if no one is looking at that data, nobody's doing anything about it, that process you have, that strategy is not going to work, right? You have to be very dynamic in the way you work today, and data is a big part of that, interpreting that data and always improving your process, always improving your methodologies and your segmentation and your prospecting efforts. So it's so important to really understand that data to improve all the time. Completely
agree. Let's just keep going. I know we're getting close to the end of this. So.
Right. Yeah. So my summary would be really and this is not. I mean, this is pretty common sense, although I don't like that that phrase really. Common sense is only common sense for those who it's common sense for. But anyhow, the buyer must be at the center of what you're doing, right? And you have to create your strategy centered around what you can help those buyers do better. And then you have to translate that into a sales system, I've called it here, really a process, maybe you call it a checklist on steroids or whatever, to really make sure that we always execute consistently, and then train your team and provide them with all the enablement content and skills that they need, and then just coach like crazy and improve. Sort of my summary of all of this. And we've seen this go, if you do that and you really build that structure around it, we see customers really doubling their quota attainment and win rates just by doing these things in a disciplined and structured manner.
Yep. So how do you visualize that? Yeah, there we go.
Yeah, exactly. So this is the same thing really, but just in visual slides, like have the strategy aligned with the customer, what you can help them with, and then just make sure your salespeople have those skills and your managers have those skills. And then you have the tools and the processes and all the technology stuff you need, and then you coach.
Yeah. So I'm looking forward to this next slide, and we always let our hosts and our sponsors talk a little bit about what they do, but George was cool enough to show us a little bit about what they do. So taking all this stuff we've talked about, you can actually sort of put it into practice with MEMBRAIN. So why don't you go ahead and show people what that looks like?
Right. So mini pitch at the end here, but I think what we've tried to do is really to visualize that process. So you have a sales process, but now how do you make it come to life? So this is just an example of how that could look in an opportunity management context. So of course you have the stages and all of that, but then in each stage you also have these checklist items, to call it that you make sure to go through all of these so you don't miss any important steps. And then beneath or under the actual sales process that you walk through, you have the information at a glance that's important. So why is this important for the client? So that's yellow in this example because it's a warning from the system that you're trying to present. So the next step is to present the solution, but the system is telling you that, hang on a second, you don't really know how they're going to make their decision. So it's a bit premature to start presenting at this stage. And you need to get who's involved. So the who box is all that. Who are we talking to? Are they willing to change? Because Melinda Gates there is not very happy about this idea. And the left box is all the facts. So the idea in this example is to sort of give you an overview of a particular deal. Are we doing the right things? Have we skipped important steps that could kill the patient? If so, what to do about it? So it's really one of the views just to give you an understanding of what I mean when I say that you can put this into a system.
So that's great. So George, so if people want to get in touch with you, there you go. How can they do that? Keep in mind, folks, if you're in the States, he's in Europe time, so it may take him an hour or two to get back to you. He only sleeps for 20 minutes at a time. Because he's an entrepreneur. But, yeah, so George, this has been really great and fascinating and very educational and inspirational, at least from my perspective of seeing things in a new light and different perspectives. So thank you so much for joining us today. We really, really appreciate it. And again, folks, please reach out to George on LinkedIn or Twitter, and we'll, I know he'd be happy to answer any additional questions you have. I think someone asked earlier, are we going to get the slides? The recording will be up the next day or so if people want to go back and take a look at some of these slides. But thank you again, George. We were really glad to have you.
Thank you. My pleasure.
All right. Take care. Bye, everybody.
Bye-bye, everybody.